et bienvenue pour cet événement. Mon nom est Étienne Bassot, je suis directeur du service de recherche pour les députés à l'EPRS. Je voudrais souhaiter une chaleureuse bienvenue à nos invités. Monsieur le gouverneur Jacques Delarosière, nous avons déjà eu le privilège de vous avoir parmi nous ici il y a quelques mois au Parlement européen pour présenter vos réflexions sur l'histoire de l'union monétaire avec certains collègues ici présents, Ivo Maas, Neil Tigeson qui a fait le voyage du Danemark et Michel Chang de Londres. C'est un de ces événements hybrides puisque nous sommes quelques-uns dans la salle, mais vous êtes nombreux derrière votre écran à suivre cet événement en ligne et je souhaite la bienvenue à tous qui nous suivent actuellement en ligne. Le thème de notre table ronde aujourd'hui, c'est le rapport Delors de 1989, à un moment de tension internationale, un moment tumultueux où l'inflation et la récession reviennent. Il est important de prendre le temps de regarder en arrière sur la genèse de l'euro. Ce sera l'objet de nos discussions aujourd'hui. Après une introduction par Anthony Tisdale et des interventions de nos panélistes, nous aurons l'occasion d'échanger jusqu'à 15 heures. Avant de commencer, je souhaite indiquer que nous avions aussi invité aujourd'hui Sophie Caroline de Margerie, qui est membre du conseil d'administration de l'Institut Jacques Delors et qui, parmi ses nombreuses fonctions antérieures, fut conseillère du président Mitterrand à un moment crucial. Mais il ne nous a pas été possible à Madame de Margerie de se joindre à nous. Enfin, je voudrais signaler que la table ronde que nous avons aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans un cycle de 2 autres événements majeurs jusqu'à la fin de l'année. Le mardi 29 novembre, Fiscal and Monetary Policy, Two Sides of the Same Coin. C'est un événement dans la salle de lecture de la bibliothèque qui sera aussi en ligne. Et un autre événement le 6 décembre, l'importance de l'euro dans l'économie globale. Et je vous invite d'ores et déjà à inscrire ces événements dans votre agenda. J'arrête ici et je donne le bâton à Anthony. Anthony était jusque récemment notre directeur général et ce travail sur l'histoire de l'euro est le sien. Et c'est lui qui a initié ce cycle d'événements et qui est devenu aussi le travail sur l'histoire de l'euro un objet de recherche personnelle et d'activité d'enseignement. C'est un plaisir, Anthony, de te retrouver. À toi d'introduire la thématique et de présenter nos invités. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed, Etienne. Welcome to everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be back here at the EPRS and to take forward a discussion on one of the most important documents that's ever been produced in the history of the European Union, namely the Delors Report. For those of you not familiar with the Delors Report, it was commissioned by the heads of state and government in June 1988 at the Hanover European Council, and it was presented some months later in April 1989 to those same heads of state and government. The mandate of the Delors Committee was to examine and propose concrete stages leading to economic and monetary union in Europe, EMU. And in many ways, it is the founding document for the single currency, drawing upon the experience of previous attempts, notably the Werner Report, and building on the process of integration through alignment of currencies in the European monetary system. The report is not a very long report. It's only 32 substantive pages. It was drawn up by a committee chaired by Jacques Delors, then the president of the European Commission. But that committee was composed of the governors of the 12 central banks of the European Union at the time, plus some experts. One of those experts is with us today, and one of those central bank governors is with us today. And it's therefore a great pleasure that Jacques Delarosière, the former president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the former managing director, rather, of the International Monetary Fund, and the former governor of the Banque de France, who was a member of the Delors Committee, has been able to travel from Paris to join us today. And with him is another colleague of his on the Delors Report, namely Niels Tigeson, currently chairman of the European Fiscal Board, which is an independent body that advises the European Commission, Professor Emeritus of International Economics at the University of Copenhagen, and somebody who served as a key policymaker in his own member state, including as senior advisor to the governor of the central bank in Denmark and also chairman of the Danish Economic Council. And they're joined by 2 academic experts who have engaged really in a lifetime of study on monetary issues in Europe. Michel Chang, who is currently director for the Transatlantic Affairs Programme and professor of European political Economy and Governance at the College of Europe in Bruges and author of Monetary Integration in the European Union, and Professor Ivo Meis, who is the Professor and Robert Triffin Chair at the Catholic University of Louvain, a former senior advisor and head of the history department in the National Bank of Belgium, and author of a recent biography of the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, which we were privileged enough to feature in the EPRS Book Talk series some months ago. They're going to talk about various aspects of the Delors Report, the process by which this report came together, the principal recommendations which it's made, and now, some third of a century later, by what they got right and what they got wrong in the work that was done by that committee. And so, without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Jacques Delors to reflect on what it was like to be part of the process of drawing up the Delors Report. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. There are not many remnants of the Delors Committee. You have two of them, nonetheless, this afternoon in this room. You have Niels Stigersen and you have myself. And I'm going to give you my recollection, my memories of my participation in the Delors Committee as I remember them. Following the Hanover summit in June 1988, I was chosen to be part of the Delors Committee on Monetary Union. I had been appointed, of course, because I was the governor at the time of the Banque de France. But the appointment was made, like that of my fellow governors, on an individual basis. For Niels, it was obviously on an individual basis because he was not governor. And this clarification, which was essential in my view, meant, according to my interpretation of the words on an individual basis, that I did not have to express myself during the committee's work as the governor of the Banque de France, but in my personal capacity. It is this interpretation that explains why I did not comply with the French Ministry of Finance's wish to prepare collectively the committee's sessions in Paris and to determine my positions in advance under the Trésor supervision. In essence, I said to the minister, M. Bérégovoy at the time, either you trust me or I must obey the instructions of the Trésor. And in the latter case, I will not be able to continue my work at the Banque de France. Eventually, we agreed with the ministry that I would inform them of the progress of the committee's work during periodic routine meetings. It was clear to me that no agreement would be possible within the committee if we could not agree on the need to establish the independence of the new central bank. By 1988, central bank independence had become an essential mantra, an essential part of the international monetary consensus. Independence was seen at the time as a guarantee of wisdom and monetary objectivity. It was believed to be the very condition of efficiency. Governments should not be able to exert any influence or attempt any pressure on central bankers. This was the price to pay for avoiding fiscal dominance. But what seemed to me to be an obvious condition for the committee's agreement put me in a delicate personal position, which I will explain. Indeed, France had never even imagined that the Banque de France could be independent of public authorities. Since Napoleon, the tradition of an institut d'émission subordinate to the government had never been the object of any discussion or exception. And it was not by a discussion between me and the French Treasury that I had the slightest chance of changing the state of mind that existed in my country on this subject. But the other view, according to which the central bank would be the reflection of the particular positions of the different governments, seemed to me to be inconceivable. How can we establish a single currency that is the result of permanent intergovernmental discussions within the central bank? Monetary decisions often have to be taken quickly and not through a diplomatic process. Therefore, I decided to speak directly to the President of the Republic of France in order to avoid the risk of being accused of betraying the trust of my country on such an important subject. Monsieur Mitterrand was very attached for political reasons to an agreement with Germany on monetary union. Such an agreement was for him the way to definitively seal the Franco-German reconciliation and to avoid the specter of new conflicts between the two nations. I therefore made an appointment with him, Monsieur Mitterrand, making it known to the Élysée that I wanted the meeting to be personal, between the two of us only. I met Monsieur Mitterrand one-to-one on December the 1st, 1988. I told him that it was clear after the first meetings of the Delors Committee that there could be no agreement without the recognition of the independence of the European Central Bank and also of the national central banks, members of the European system. If we wanted an agreement, it was, in my view, the sine qua non condition. Monsieur Mitterrand, I could see him sitting on his sofa. He did not answer me directly. He made some general comments about the orientation of our societies to delegate functions or powers to independent institutions. I concluded from these vague statements that I had received an orange light rather than a green light, but certainly not a red light. This conversation had an important effect on the further discussions in the committee. The French representative was expected to have major difficulties with the independence proposals that came from the most influential members of the committee. But, surprising everyone, I agreed easily with the clearest formulations of the notion of independence. I even added further details in the independence reaching performance. This attitude may have disconcerted some of the more skeptical members of the committee. Nevertheless, the notion and the modalities of independence were never an obstacle in the progress of the discussion, which facilitated, of course, the unanimous conclusion of the committee's work at the end of the process. Shortly after the publication of the Delors Report on the 12th of April, 1989, I was subjected to a barrage of criticism from the French Treasury in a scene that remains engraved in my memory. But the report had been adopted, and it was ratified in its monetary parts by the European Council of Strasbourg in December 1989 without any French objection. Then it was extended to the coordination of economic policies in 1990 by the Dublin Council. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Delors, for those important insights and for recreating the atmosphere of what it was like at the time of the Delors Report, and also for sharing your strategy in effect of putting, I presume, putting the Bundesbank in a situation where they couldn't, as it were, not take yes for an answer. Very much in the same genre, we're going to now ask Niels Tegersen, who was one of the three experts sitting on the Delors Report, to share his recollections and insights from the work of the committee at the time. His two colleagues as expert members were Alexandra Lamfalussy, who was running the Bank of International Settlements at the time, and Michel Boyer, who was the president of the Banco Exterior de España, but was there in a particular capacity to act as a bridge with the upcoming Spanish presidency of the Council, which was going to, in effect, steer the political conclusions that would be drawn when the Delors Report was submitted to the heads of state and government. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the honor of speaking after my mentor, Jacques Delors. I cannot share similar fundamental experiences as he has done with you. Let me go back even a little bit further than the Delors Report and ask, why did we get the euro? Why did the project succeed at a time when it had failed so dismally a couple of decades earlier? I think the main argument at the time was the synergies with the startup of the single market, which was unlikely in the view of many to have been completed and sustained in the absence of fixed exchange rates and ideally a common currency. Adjustable exchange rates could undermine the process of implementing more than 300 directives of detail in the single market. So the internal argument was the essential one, and it was strongly supported primarily by European industry. It was contested by a number of economists at the time, and it was certainly rejected by a few countries, by the UK in particular, that did not see the need for going all the way to a single currency in order to have a single market. I think the euro has delivered on this commitment. The single market survives, and quite well. After 24 turbulent years, can we really imagine that we could have maintained a single market in those times? I think one thing is it has delivered on this central promise. But the single market plan also comprised of capital controls, which would make a system of fixed adjustable exchange rates very hard to manage, if not impossible. So that was in itself also an argument for moving to a single currency. There was also what I would call a strong external argument. The experience of the 70s and the 80s made a single currency look essential in providing more robustness vis-a-vis the shocks coming from movements in the US dollar and in international energy markets, a familiar challenge today. And also important, I think, was that German officials were getting a bit tired of being the, as they call it, the Prügelknabe, the whipping boys of the Americans and others in the IMF and the G7 for their performance in Europe, their supposedly leadership of Europe. And even the German Bundesbank talked openly about Europeanizing that role in a single currency. There were also more purely political arguments, of course. Sharing monetary decision-making with the Bundesbank was a motive that was strengthened by economic convergence, which had occurred notably in France, where the inflation rate had fallen to nearly 2% at the time. And Germany, I think, preferred to stabilize the system and enter into agreements with several European partners rather than doing it bilaterally, which would have been another option with France. That argument mattered less in the smaller countries in Europe. Let's take the Netherlands as an example. They accepted more readily the asymmetry of the European monetary system that went before, and they would have been happy probably to continue with that for some, as would my own country, Denmark. Some factors facilitated, relative to the Werner Plan of 1970, the realization of economic and monetary union. There was no longer the emphasis of that time on parallelism between monetary and fiscal integration. There was, on the contrary, a sharp distinction. Monetary policy, which was seen as the primary channel of spillovers between countries in Europe, could more easily be conducted jointly. National central banks were in some countries gaining de facto independence, and that process would be further facilitated by the European project. Fiscal policy, in contrast, was to remain a national responsibility, but subject to upper limits to deficits and debt, and without access to monetary financing or lender of last resort facilities in the coming central bank. The role of fiscal policy, and I think this was essential in stabilization, had lost its allure in the 70s and the 80s. 2 decades of often pro-cyclical fiscal outcomes had illustrated the difficulties of the Werner Plan of designing stabilization at the European level, a key ambition in the Werner Report. These shifts in policy perspectives, which were supported both by practical experience and by economic theory, paved the way for what I would call the Maastricht bargain. You could offer lower and more stable inflation and interest rates in many economies than they could have achieved on their own, in return for some degree of fiscal prudence, as exemplified by the rules. The key issue today, of course, is, does this bargain remain valid? And if so, how can it be sustained? We got used in the time of low interest rates for a long time that maybe fiscal prudence was not necessary to obtain that result, but we are now back in a situation that looks more like the normal situation. Let me say a couple of words also about the fiscal and financial underpinnings, because we have gone through several rounds of reforms subsequently that suggests that the ideas in the Delors Report and in the Maastricht Treaty were not fully up to date. We can say today that the fiscal system has not delivered enough of reducing the risks of public finances becoming unsustainable. 6 countries today have debt ratios in triple figures, and they're not declining in even propitious times. No debt-related procedures have been launched. And recent reform proposals would intensify surveillance of high debt countries by negotiating debt reduction paths linking flexibility to investment and reforms. But let me leave these matters for discussion in the subsequent questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Niels Teggersen, for those important observations and recollections from that period, and for just joining us online. This is an EPRS E3 roundtable, which is looking at how the euro was born, the 1989 Delors Report revisited. And our next panelist, from a more academic perspective, is going to reflect on the significance of the Delors Report at that time and subsequently. Over to Michelle Shang of the College of Europe. Michelle.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. So I wanted to first give credit to the work of the Delors Report and what it was attempting to do at the time in building the foundation for economic and monetary union, because what that would look like was not something that was entirely obvious. This is something that the European community was venturing into the unknown. There was no manual or guidebook on how to create a single currency, especially among such a diverse economic grouping as the European community back in 1988 that has only grown more diverse since that time. So thinking more about the context externally and internally, I think it's important to note that economic and monetary union plans were building on a momentum and on success and on a burgeoning consensus. So it's building on the momentum, as already mentioned by Professor Thygesen, on the spillover and synergies with the single market. It's also building on the momentum of a successful period of exchange rate cooperation under the European monetary system. So it also had this aura of success surrounding it. And then finally, we also saw a consensus around the institutional ideas, as Mr. de la Rosière had already mentioned, on central bank independence that also had strong political support within Germany, the country that had already emerged as the de facto leader of the European monetary system. And this enthusiasm grew post-Delors Report with German unification and the Maastricht Treaty. However, going back specifically to the Delors Report and what was in it, the beginning of the report notes the previous attempt by the Werner Report before it, but that member states had now expressed their political will to establish an economic and monetary union. And I think that's really important to point out that political will, because that political will is going to determine how far they'll go, what direction they'll go in, how they will define economic and monetary union, and how they're going to operationalize it. As I said at the beginning, there is no guidebook on what this is going to look like. So we had political choices made on the timing and structure of economic and monetary union. We heard about the decision for an independent central bank that already had a lot of academic support and some more support among central bankers internationally. However, we can also point to the independent central banks and their policies focusing on inflation, generating specific winners and losers within the economy as well. Moreover, it mimics the existing German institutional structure that also favored an export economy in removing their need to periodically revalue their currency under the European monetary system. There was also the decision not to have a fiscal union. And so economic theory might have told us differently at that time, but that was what they went with because that was the limit of the political will. So there were the political preferences at this time that dictated this sort of fiscal union, especially a fiscal capacity, not being part of economic and monetary union. And then finally, the Delors Report underlined the need for greater convergence of economic policy. But again, how do you define that? What does that mean? This is going along not only economic ideas at the time, but also what is politically possible. So I'll leave off there.
Thank you very much indeed, Michelle. Very interesting issues that are raised there. And now, again, for an academic perspective, but also that of a policymaker in practice, Ivo Maes, who's going to reflect on this from his experience both in teaching monetary integration, monetary politics and monetary policy, and also as somebody who's been working in the National Bank of Belgium. Ivo.
Yeah, first of all, many thanks. It's a great honor to be on this roundtable, on such a prestigious group of participants. I would like to make a little bit go back in time, go to the Werner Report, and then also go further more to the present situation. First, the Werner Report. Well, it's the time of change in economics. The government has a key role in steering the economy, and that's the atmosphere of the Werner Report. What is element? What is key to the Werner Report in its definition of economic and monetary union? It is a symmetric economic and monetary union. Two pillars with a center of decision making, both on the monetary side, European system of central banks, but also for the economic pillar, the center of decision-making for economic policy. Let's then go to the Delors Report. Now, in the collection of papers which were produced to prepare the report, there is, at least to my appreciation, a very interesting paper by the two secretaries of the committee, Günther Baer and Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, the Werner Report Revisited. And there you see what are the lessons which the Delors Committee was trying to learn from the Werner experience. And here, just for this occasion, there is a section on the intrinsic weaknesses of the Werner Report. So what were the really intrinsic weaknesses of the Werner Report, leaving out the rest of the paper? Firstly, inappropriate policy conception. A Keynesian policy conception, the government can steer the economy. Secondly, institutional ambiguities. It was not clear who was responsible for certain decisions. Thirdly, insufficient constraints on national policies. And fourthly, lack of internal momentum, no triggers to go from one phase to the next phase. The conclusion of the report also says very clearly, as also already underlined by Niels, the full potential of the internal market will only be realized with satisfactory monetary arrangements. We are really in this one market, one money logic. Let's go then to the Delors Report and associated with it the Maastricht Treaty. Well, there is a new paradigm. There is a new economic paradigm, sound money. Sound money, central bank independence, and skepticism about discretionary economic policies. What is the structure of the report? Well, it's very different from the Werner Report. It is asymmetric. There is very clearly a monetary pole, the monetary pillar, with European Central Bank, European system of central banks, worked out in a lot of detail. But for the economic pillar, well, it's more vague. Maybe the members of the report will not, the committee will not be completely agree, but I would say it's much vaguer. Looking at budgetary policy, well, one of the key sentences in the report is binding rules for budgetary policies. Comes back a few times in the report. And as far as I know, one of the members of the committee who was most concerned about budgetary policy and also produced a paper on budgetary policy was Alexandre Lamfalussy. And Alexandre Lamfalussy, one of the quotations he was giving at several conferences is, inflation is a monetary phenomenon, as shooting people is a ballistic phenomenon. If I can take this quote even in these hard times. Now, what did Lamfalussy say? Look, we need a type of environment if you want central bank independence, and this the experience of the 1970s, high public deficits which had to be financed by the central banks, you cannot have central bank independence. And so there this binding rules for budgetary policy. What do you see in the report, in the Delors Report? Big difference with the Werner Report, triggers for the EMU process. One really tries to have triggers to go from one phase to the next. What is rather absent in the report? Well, two things which, to my taste, are rather absent. Firstly, the financial dimension. Banking, capital markets union. And there my question is, was this a deliberate oversight or were there reasons for this? And something else which was rather absent is the international role of the euro. And this, I think, is together with these one market, one money logic. Now, looking at the present situation, States after the introduction of the euro, well, the first thing to say is we have had much more crisis than expected. And also as a policymaker and as a professor, I had to revise my syllabus much more than I had expected every time when a new crisis came along. Now, what are a few key elements? Firstly, there is a resurrection of Keynesian economics. A resurrection of Keynes, which was declared dead by the sound money paradigm, is back. Now, who was one of the first persons who called for discretionary expansionary fiscal policy? Well, after the Lehman disaster and meeting of the European League for Economic Cooperation, where we were discussing the situation, trying to understand, and then one person stood up and said, what we need now is a serious expansionary fiscal policy. It was Alexandre Lamfalussy. And so one saw that when you are in real crisis situations, you can need fiscal policy. Now, how has fiscal policy been doing further? Since then, fiscal policy, one has been relying more and more on fiscal policy. And with low interest rates, that was no problem. So the sound money paradigm has been a bit discarded. What is one of the other elements? The ECB. Well, it's a strong supranational institution, but as many people say, it has been the only game in town. And there you really see that, as Jacques Delors was saying with his meeting with Bérégovoy, the Treasury people, the conclusion of Bérégovoy was, well, we need central bank independence, but now we also need a macroeconomic governance. And there the ECB is suffering because of its institutional loneliness. We now have the debates on revision of the fiscal framework, central fiscal capacity. But lastly, we also have a return of inflation. Return of inflation. Now, what are the reasons? Last year, there was a whole debate. Was it temporary or not? And this year, the temporary school was really losing ground. And so one has to look back, what are the more structural reasons for this inflation, which naturally has been reinforced by the energy shock resulting from the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Ivo, thank you very much indeed for that. You raised issues which echo and build on Michel's comments concerning what one might call an asymmetric or incomplete monetary union, how far the Delors Report itself was perhaps defective, or how far the Maastricht Treaty, which transposed its key recommendations into action, fell short of what might be required in order to have a fully coherent economic as well as monetary union. It would be very interesting to hear from the two people who were present at the creation of monetary union, whether or not they think those debates now are in much sharper and clearer relief. And if you could go back to redesigning the original concept in the Delors Report, what things were missing which could perhaps now better have been in place? Perhaps, first of all, Jacques Delors.
Yes, I can say a word, although much has been said already. The consubstantial paradox of the euro is that it's a single currency, but the economic policies and fiscal policies are left to the discretion of the member states. So, and on top of that, unlike in the United States, the Eurozone has no private risk-sharing mechanism capable of absorbing economic shocks. Now, what I would like to say very briefly is this. This situation favors the growth of heterogeneities between member states Heterogeneity in per capita income activity has increased amongst the members since the creation of the euro. The highly industrialized and competitive countries are becoming stronger because of the extension of their trade from which they benefit, as well as the capacity of southern quote-unquote countries to import because of the existence of a common currency that is stronger than their currencies would have been if they had remained national. The South, quote unquote, less industrialized and more a producer of low value added services, inevitably gains less. In fact, per capita incomes have diverged very significantly since 2000. Productive specialization, which is a normal phenomenon, tends to strengthen in a heterogeneous monetary zone and to create growing divergences between living standards. The stronger countries have become even stronger, and the weakest have become, in relative terms, weaker. In fact, as we know, from the beginning of the Union, the different countries of the zone took advantage of their freedom in terms of economic policy. Broadly speaking, the northern states concentrated on strengthening their industry, practiced high decentralized wage negotiations, and sought to keep their public accounts under control. The countries of the South, on the other hand, focused on consumer demand, credit, social redistribution, without much concern for fiscal consequences. So how can this danger of growing heterogeneity be avoided? It's very difficult because monetary policy in the Union can only be average, quote unquote. It is not strict enough for the countries most prone to overheating, which further increases the disparities. How can we change that? The doctrine is very clear. If we can't adjust exchange rates, costs need to be adjusted, i.e., lower wages and increased job mobility. But trade union traditions combined with the persistence of monetary illusion explain why these recommendations are difficult to apply. Another way would be to strengthen economic policy cooperation between member states. We know very well that the Stability and Growth Pact was not respected at the very beginning by France and Germany, which had a contagious effect on the others. And the public debt accumulated by some member states is now reaching worrying proportions. So I feel that the member states have not taken their destiny into their own hands by ensuring the minimum of coordination that would have kept the system alive. It is not too late, but leadership will be needed to repair the existing and to ensure the future. The first and urgent task is to replace the Stability Pact with a real mechanism. Good proposals are on the table for the last 2 days. It's up to Europe to play. I'll finish now. In sum, Mandel's old trilemma concerning optimal currency areas still holds. When exchange rates are fixed, and even more when they have disappeared in a single currency, one cannot have both freedom of capital and freedom of economic policies of member states. One of these elements must give way. And since the Union is based or the concept of a single market, people, goods, and capital, it is necessary to limit the freedom of members in the area of economic policy. This is the condition for the survival of the Union. Perhaps, as Ivo has said a moment ago, the report was not sufficiently clear on this imperative, because this constraint of cooperation has been forgotten. Yet it lies at the heart of monetary union. If a federal system cannot be implemented for fiscal policy, it is necessary to organize a real cooperation between member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those extremely thought-provoking remarks. And I'd now like to move on to Niels Teggersen to give his take on exactly the same set of issues. Over to you.
Thank you. I think one has to admit that the Delors Report, which was produced after all in a period of 8 months and with a limited mandate to how do you construct a monetary union, basically, it left out some issues, and Jacques has touched on the most important ones. I would mention 3 in descending order of importance. First is the divergence, a longer-term structural problem. Does the euro promote or contain divergence within Europe? There are indeed many experiences in the 25 years it has existed now where we've seen divergence prior to the financial crisis, as a result of the financial crisis, when the imbalances that had been created had to come unstuck. So during that period, there was indeed increasing divergence and outright crisis in a number of states, illustrated by the fact that 4 of them had to go through rigorous conditional lending programs. I think, however, looking forward, that we should not necessarily take this as a law of nature, even with the existing monetary union. 2 considerations. One is we have seen in the past 2-3 years some efforts of joint initiatives that supplement and correct some of that tendency of divergence. I'm thinking, of course, of the Next Generation EU and its main complement, the Resilience and Recovery Facility, which has indeed, with redistributive features, tried to correct some of that divergence. And if we look, secondly, at the recovery from the pandemic and during the energy crisis, the countries that are regarded as weak in Europe, typically Southern European countries, the peripheral countries, have on the whole done better than the North in Europe. I don't want to focus too much on Germany, but the German success in creating a strong manufacturing base is somewhat eroding. We are faced with a country that has now increased the minimum wage more than in France, I believe. It has a problem with ensuring energy costs at anything like the same level as in the past. And it sees its major export market in China holding back. So there are vulnerabilities all over Europe. It's not a consolation, of course, that the strong become weaker. It would be better that the weak become stronger. But if you look at the growth rates for 21 to 24, you will get a picture that some of the imbalance that Jacques has rightly referred to is being corrected. But it won't be persisting in the corrections, because the underlying tendencies will catch up. So we need to pursue these initiatives further and go further, notably in some more joint initiatives at the European level. My second example of omissions in the Delors Report was a disregard of the implications of financial integration. There was too much talk about how much the euro would do for goods markets, but not enough about the impact on integration of financial markets that the euro has had, which has led to much more volatile and large capital flows than we had imagined at the time, creating or helping to create crisis, but also creating a kind of power of financial markets over monetary policy, which is to me as worrisome as that of the fiscal authorities, because it's mainly the pressure of the financial markets that pushes the ECB and others towards thinking of new ways of supporting countries that are in difficulties and minimizing the spreads. Some of that has been helped by the effort at creating a banking union and more efficient capital markets, but not enough, certainly so far. And we need to have more emphasis by governments on maintaining sustainability to help the ECB resist that kind of pressure to smooth out or cover up, defend, if you like, the weak economies in Europe, and maybe some of the recent revisions that are proposed now for the rules. The third omission is, of course, more discussion of the fiscal rules. In fact, now on what I would call the fifth round of reform of the fiscal rules relative to what was imagined at Maastricht is a sign that we are not at the end station yet. I mean, we did discuss fiscal policy a lot in the Delors Report, and we tried to also define this balance between market pressures on countries from what governments themselves should do. And Lamfalussy, not least, pushed us in the direction that a rules-based system could help in not only in guiding the markets, maybe containing some of their nervous trends, but also push governments earlier towards the kind of adjustment we would want. But that process is clearly not finished, but there's a lot of awareness on it, and I think that that is, in a sense, a lesser problem immediately than the two others I mentioned, the longer-term tendency to prevent divergences from reoccurring and to lower the pressure from financial markets on smoothing out and defending weak currencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. We already actually have a couple of questions in using the so-called Slido system. So please don't be backward in coming forward with those questions. I'll try and take as many of them as I can. The first question that we've got in is from somebody called Sabine, who asks a little bit about Jacques Delors personally and the way he chaired the Delors Committee and how he approached the work of the committee in order to get a maximum degree of agreement among the different member states, represented, of course, in a personal capacity by their governors of central banks, which was a very delicate and challenging process. And I just wondered if either of those two people who were present would like to comment on this.
I can say a word on that. The answer to the question is offhand. Delors was let the discussion move on, develop, but he was not guiding the discussion nor posing limits, barriers to the discussion. He left the consensus and the ideas develop. He was a hands-off president, and if the report managed to get a unanimous support at the end with a British reservation, but nonetheless the support of everybody, it is because, in my view, Delors was not a directive chairman. If he had been, there would have been many oppositions within the committee. The fact that he let the discussions develop was a very good choice.
I don't know whether Niels would like to.
I certainly can endorse that view, and I remind you that the stroke of genius, if you like, of Delors was the mandate also, which he helped to develop for the committee, which was not to decide whether monetary union was a good idea or not. It was like an examination question where you say, assume we want to build a monetary union. How should we go about it? What should it look like at the end? And how should we get there? And that was a kind of agenda that the central bankers found it much easier to agree on than if you had asked them, is it a good idea or not? That would have been a very confusing discussion with an unclear outcome, I think. So that was, I think, a very good way of directing the discussion. And I certainly agree that he also managed not to antagonize people. He was very respectful of the central bank governors, having started his career in Banque de France. Maybe that helped. So he had sympathy for the central bank governors. And I remind you that monetary policy that was discussed was not something that governments had to agree to. That was precisely the point of Jacques' explanation of independence of central banks. It was not, for instance, the German governments negotiating interest rates. It was the question of governors of their two respective central banks coming together and judging on the basis of the overall evolution of a euro area how interest rates should be managed.
Thank you for that. And it's worth noting that in advance of the Delors Report and the mandate that Jacques Delors received personally to chair that group of central bank governors, he was no stranger to that particular group of people because he had accepted an invitation as Commission President some years before to attend their monthly meetings in Basel at the Bank of International Settlements. So over time, he had built up a certain measure of trust and confidence with the central bank governors, which meant that when he became the chair of that committee, it didn't seem quite as unusual or strange as it might otherwise have done so. I'm wondering whether our other two panelists might have any perspectives that they want to add on what both Jacques and Niels have said so far, both about the asymmetry issue and the incompleteness of the monetary union, or about the Delors style as they have observed it. Michelle.
Okay, thank you. I'd be interested in commenting a little bit on the incompleteness of economic and monetary union. And there was this article that was published a few years ago by Jean Pisani-Ferry, where he had referred to the known unknowns and unknown unknowns of economic and monetary union, and not to go too much into the direction of the article itself, but also expand on it. As Niels had mentioned, that link between monetary union and financial integration is something that had not been appreciated at the time in a way that became quite obvious during the global financial crisis. And I would also note that the issue of financial supervision and a European financial supervision was a very long-standing one. And there had already been discussions on whether there should be integrated financial supervision, and countries including Germany and the UK were against this and having further integration. So coming back to the limits of political will that I had indicated before, that it was known but not appreciated the extent to which it would become very important. Also, I would point to the issue that had been identified by the economic divergence and the problems that it creates, that also by some actors during this period, especially in France and Italy, that there was, after the 1980s, and we saw a certain degree of economic convergence in the European economies, including the gradual lowering of inflation and lower interest rates that came with it, and greater exchange rate stability, that in some circles there's this expectation that monetary union would accelerate this and would provide incentives for further integration. So as I noted, there's no handbook, no guidebook we could follow for what monetary union should look like. We had some expectations on what it might look like, and not all of them evolved the way that they had been expected to.
Many thanks for that. Ivo, would you like to add something?
Can I maybe give a few comments to complement on Delors and his style? Firstly, Delors officially was a socialist, but de facto he was closer to the Christian Democrats and to Helmut Kohl. And so he could combine this. He was a bridging figure between France and Germany, between socialists and Christian Democrats, which made him, he could understand both, which was very important and go along. And he was a strong supporter when Kohl launched a German unification, of which Mitterrand, Thatcher were very critical. And there he very strongly supported Kohl, which Kohl was very grateful for. Secondly, Delors was always interested in the monetary area. And monetary union was always one of his key aims. And so when he became president of the commission, he did a tour of the capitals, which is the habit, testing out which project can you launch. A single market, a defense union, a single currency. Now, doing the tour, a single currency and a defense union was clear did not work. And so pragmatic as he was, well, let's start with the single market. And there he already tried in the Single European Act, he tried to have the monetary dimension. Also, when he became president of the Commission, he took himself the monetary portfolio. The monetary portfolio, which traditionally is part of ECFIN, the Economic and Financial Directorate, and it was the Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, which traditionally went to the meetings of the Committee of Governors. Delors said, no, I, as the President of the Commission, I keep the Monetary Directorate of ECFIN in my portfolio personally, and I go to Brussels. So you see how he was preparing the strategy. So it was a really long-term strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Now, we've got questions coming in through the Slido system, and I'm going to group 3 that have just come in so that any panelist who would like to pick up on them has an opportunity to do so. One question, which I think is very interesting indeed, if I may say so, but I don't know who it's from because it's from Anonymous, is would the single market have survived the last 14 years, that's since the economic and financial crisis of 2008, in the absence of the single currency?
Yeah.
Jacques?
No, it's a very fundamental question. The answer is, of course, impossible to give because we can't make history in that way. The probability is that the single market would have been spoiled, perhaps not completely broken, but certainly spoiled and damaged if we hadn't had the monetary union. But you see, my answer is also the beginning, the harbinger of a problem. Because if the common market, if the single market is too dependent on monetary policy, you have something that is very pervasive and very pernicious, which is that you help the lower productivity countries to buy, that is to be active importers on that single market, because the currency which they have is stronger than it would have been had they had national currencies. And on the other side of the spectrum, the countries that were stronger productivity-wise were even stronger because they were not subject to the type of appreciation which would have been a market appreciation had they been purely national. So yes, the question is very pertinent, and it's probably that the market would not have survived in that form without the monetary union. But the monetary union itself creates another contradiction, which I have thus explained. So nothing is simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else among the panel like to come in on this? No, let's, Eva?
Well, I fully agree with Jacques. So there, one way is that, well, I maybe could add, and it's more to make explicit, having the single currency before we would have crisis in the exchange rate system, which would come earlier. And so we missed an early warning system with the monetary union, which we had with the European monetary system, where we had these exchange rate crises earlier. And we got then to the euro area crisis was much deeper than the crisis which we had in the...
If you allow me, I fully agree with Ivo. The complexity of the issue is this one. The more you protect, quote unquote, the weaker countries, the more they take advantage of that protection. And the more you protect, in the wrong sense of the word, the stronger countries, because you avoid them too much of an appreciation, the more they take advantage of the situation. But the heterogeneity, which was at the beginning of the process, becomes even bigger. So it is a sort of internal contradiction. You can only solve that contradiction by either fiscal unity or by cooperation, but real cooperation. And this brings us to the lack of cooperation, too frequently observed since the beginning of the Union, in terms of Growth and Stability Pact. And that is why the discussion of the new communication which came out 2 days ago is so important. And we're not going to discuss this because it would take time and we haven't prepared it, but it's an essential point, because if you don't do it through cooperation, you monetary profligacy, and that's always going to be sanctioned either by the markets or by inflation.
Thank you for that. In fact, that question prompted such an interesting series of responses came from Ulrich. We have 2 or 3 more questions that have come in. Going to group them together. Petar asks, comments that Bulgaria is planning to join the euro in 2024, and asks what should be the role of non-financial factors, for example, the rule of law, in approving membership of euro countries. Of course, once convergence criteria are met, as I understand it, membership is automatic. But that raises a broader question as to whether or not the convergence criteria should have been more restrictive at the time that monetary union was designed, and whether or not they were interpreted in a particularly generous way. Maybe I'll ask Michelle what her take on those issues are.
Well, I would say that, first of all, when it comes to the accession to economic and monetary union, that is not as automatic as it might seem at the start, and that there were already in the beginning, some built-in discretion for the member states to allow countries that already in the first round of economic and monetary union allowed countries that did not meet the convergence criteria. So thinking of countries like Italy and also Belgium. So there's that. There's also the discretion that they had in, I believe, 2006, when they were evaluating some further applications for economic and monetary union and what to do about how to interpret the inflation criterion, because the inflation criterion, it seems relatively straightforward, but it was designed in the Maastricht Treaty at a time when there is the expectation that most countries are going to be part of economic and monetary union, and you wouldn't have such a large number of countries that are out. So we had, the case of a country that if you looked at the economic figures for euro area countries, they would have met that criterion. But if you look at the economic figures for the European Union, which included countries like Sweden, Denmark, they don't. And so the room to play around with that is perhaps more substantial than might be obvious. And so in terms of the rule of law having a role in it, it doesn't, as you've already noted, that this is a different issue than economic and monetary union. But one could also imagine the interpretation, which has also become over time, less generous as a result of the crisis that we had in the euro area and the experience of allowing countries, like Greece, for example, which also did not meet the original convergence criteria when coming in. But finally, I'd also like to note the convergence criteria themselves, that those have also come under fire, but given that they are enshrined in the treaty, very difficult to change.
Any other panelists like to come in on this question concerning what convergence criteria exist, how they've been applied, or how they might be tightened? No, in which case I'm going to move on to a comment and a question that's come in from Elena, who notes that if you go back to the Werner Report, there was quite an emphasis upon the desirability of social partners being factored into economic policy making in the European Union, and wondering whether this particular issue or dimension featured at all in the debates at the time of the Delors Report. So, in other words, what kind of interaction with civil society, and indeed more generally, what kind of democratic interface and oversight was programmed into the process in the way that the Delors Committee conducted its proceedings?
Thank you. I don't recall that this issue was discussed. I must say that if we look today at how consultations are undertaken, be it reforming the fiscal rules, for example, the Commission launched a huge exercise where all institutions were elaborately consulted in 2021. There's a big report from the Commission summing that up. And of course, all official documents, including the recent one from the Commission, goes to the Economic and Social Council, representatives there. So I think there is a rich dialogue. There are just even more people who are now involved in the dialogue than was the case in 1970. And I must also say that in 1970, there was also the reason maybe for this explicit reference that this was still the time of incomes policies where contacts with the social partners were seen as an essential part of macroeconomic policy. That is no longer the case.
Jacques? No, in which case I'm going to ask a question which bears upon something which has come up, namely the recent proposals which are tabled by the European Commission for the reform and updating of the Stability and Growth Pact. There's been a wide debate about the extent to which this might change the power structure between the Commission and member states. But I wonder, putting your hat on not only as former governor, Jacques Delors, but also from your period running the International Monetary Fund, what do you think this kind of responsibility would be for the European Commission if it were to take on the process of having bilateral dialogues with individual member state capitals on their macroeconomic and indeed microeconomic policies?
Yeah, well, I thank you, Anthony, for having raised this question. It's a bit late in the day and we're close to the end of the session, but what happened 2 days ago with the communication of the Commission is indeed a very important phenomenon, because they have departed from numerical, rather abstract figures, which were the 3%, the 60%, the 120%, etc. They have left that paradigm, and they have moved towards what you say bilateral consultations. I prefer the word consultation than negotiation personally, because in negotiation there is an element of balance of power, and this should not be the case. This is an economic matter, but it is a bilateralization of the relationship with the member states, between the Commission and the members. And it is a change in the system. In order to comply with that notion, you need to have a Commission that is independent enough to handle this bilateral set of talks, of conversations, of consultations, and not to diverge for political reasons from what they feel is fundamental in the notion of reaching a debt situation that is possible. So in a way, when I was reading the communication, I wasn't feeling so much about the difference between the Growth and Stability Pact on the one side and the new features that were appearing to me. I was thinking, if I were the Commission, would I have the guts, the power, the independence of views, the technical capabilities to engage with member countries in such dialogues? And in a way, what we have seen in that communication a couple of days ago is something that should be the harbinger of a new Commission, a Commission with more, I would say, credibility, less political involvement in the countries. Because if you have that, something a bit like the Article 4 in the IMF, you will have a set of calibrations of policies in terms of the sustainability of debt that will be more credible than the non-obedience to 60%, which are impossible to abide by. So I think it's an enormous chance that we are witnessing, but it's a chance that will demand as much from the Commission as from the states in question. That's my view.
Many thanks for that. I'd like to see if any other of the panelists would like to give an initial reaction to the Commission's proposals, which bear directly upon the operability and the future of economic and monetary union. Michel?
So economic and monetary union, specifically the Stability and Growth Pact, has been criticized quite a bit over the years for very different reasons. And Professor Thiessen had mentioned earlier the NGEU and Recovery and Resilience Facility, many as the real game changer. And so for all of the reforms that are suggested in the Commission proposal that are very welcome, especially scrapping the reduction of 1/20th per year, which is certainly unrealistic and not credible in a post-COVID pandemic economic world. It did also abandon the innovations of NGEU, which I do know were meant to be temporary, but were always viewed with an eye towards, could there be some permanent feature where the Commission would be able to provide a positive incentive and not just the threat of financial sanctions for the for abiding by the Stability and Growth Pact rules. And so that positive dimension has been taken out, that we'd originally seen with the promise of the NGEU, and it's back to the quasi-automatic threat of financial sanctions, which I still regard skeptically.
Thank you for that. We also have a question in, again from Anonymous. To what extent was the absence of fiscal integration, stroke harmonization, a deliberate policy choice at the time of the Delors Report versus being an oversight? I think in a way that question's already been answered, but if there's anybody who would like to come in on that, please do.
I could add one thing, Chairman. It was not oversight. It was the fact that the countries were not, and they are not, ready to have a fiscal union. It would have made a lot of sense to have a fiscal union, but neither France nor Germany were ready to harmonize and merge their fiscal policies. So it wasn't oversight. I mean, these people who were assembled in the Delors Committee had normal reactions in this field. They knew perfectly well that the absence of a fiscal policy was a big problem. But we were not ready, and we're still not ready to have fiscal and more generally economic policy integration or harmonization. And that is the weakness of the euro, which can only be compensated or reduced by a very strong element of cooperation. Because if you haven't got cooperation, then the system cannot work for long. So we need to put some flesh now into the very interesting communication of the Commission. I don't say it's perfect. I think it is certainly amendable, but as Michel was saying, it does answer a certain number of impossibilities which exist today. And you can't build a system on some impossibilities. We have to take care of them. And I think bilateral dialogue is a right solution. But in saying that, I'm showing a big degree of idealism and hope for the future, because, as I said, it will take the Commission a strong leadership and complete independence, because you can't be semi-independent on judging a debt situation. Either you're right or you're wrong, but you can't say, well, I'm going to help you a little bit with the figures. So you need to have people who are very strongly equipped in terms of macroeconomic policy calculations, and I think that Commission is embarking on a very important new course.
Thank you very much for that. If I may, going to take advantage of my chairing this part of the discussion to ask a further final question, but specifically of Niels Thygesen. But it flows really from the last question that came up and which Jacques Delors answered, which bears upon, if you like, the Franco-German dimension to the design of monetary union. I'd like to ask you who you thought, sparing the blushes of yourself and Jacques Delors, who you thought the most influential members of the Delors Committee were, and how far Carl Otto Perl was determinant in the outcome, because it was very well known at the time that Carl Otto Perl had some reservations, let's put it that way, about the emerging design, even though he signed the report, and there were rumours that there'd been some behind-the-scenes struggle between him and Chancellor Kohl about this. But do you think, in a way, as we alluded to earlier, that the reaction of France's representative on the Delors Committee made it impossible, in a way, for Germany to dig in so hard that they could stop the monetary union process, if that was indeed a view in the Bundesbank? But may I ask Niels, first of all, to give a view on this?
I understand the gist of your question, and I feel the historian whom you are behind this question. It's impossible to say what would have happened if I had acted differently than I did, if I had been the faithful member of the Trésor and said, no, we can't go that far in terms of independence. I don't know what would have happened. But what I know is that the fact that I never objected to in the slightest way, to the most transparent and clear argumentation on the independence of the central bank. The fact that I never discussed this facilitated the agreement. Now, was Carl Otto unhappy of this facilitation? I do not know. But what I can tell you goes back to what our friend Thygesen has just said. Carl Otto, during all those negotiations of the Delors Committee, played by the rules of the game. And the rules of the game were exactly those that you said a moment ago. It wasn't, do you like a monetary union? He would have said he wouldn't like it, that's for sure. But the question was, if the governments decided one day that they wanted to go in that direction, what would be the technical implications for a central bank? And on that, he was cooperative in the discussion. And of course, on that, I facilitated the agreement by my position, which was itself agreed in a way that I interpreted as such by the French government. I can tell you it was not agreed at all, because when I was told off in the Ministry of Finance after the publication of the Delors Report, I felt very well the distance between what I had defended and the position of the Trésor. But that's another story. The fact of the matter was that the report was approved. And the report said that the independence of the central bank was complete. Has the independence of the central bank been so total today? I have the greatest doubts on that, but that's another story.
Thank you for that. Niels, would you like to add your own perspective on this?
There's little to add to Jacques' authoritative story. My impression was also that Carl Pöll was happy with the outcome of the Delors Report, contrary to what many people had expected from him, because the two basic principles of independence of the central bank and commitment to price stability were to be the main features of the coming European Central Bank. And that was good enough for him. He thought it was finally, Germany was able to export stability to the rest of Europe, which it hadn't been able to in the past. So he saw it as progress. Thank you.
Thank you. So they did take yes for an answer. I think that's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you not only to our panelists, but all of you who've been watching online. As you know, this event will be pérennisé, as the French would say, through the YouTube process, and hopefully there'll be many more people who will be able to share in the insights from both practitioners and academics about the birth of the euro. And I now pass the microphone back to the director of the Members Research Service in EPRS, who's going to say a little bit about upcoming events. Over to Etienne Bassot, and thank you once again, everybody.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and let me join you to thank our speakers, our panelists, and also the very lively online audience that put so many interesting questions. Just to say that in addition to the two events that I announced at the beginning on fiscal and monetary policy, on the one hand, two sides of the same coin, family discussion, and the other one on the importance of the euro in the global economies, are for the 29th and the 6th of December. We'll have later this week on Thursday and Friday our annual conference on foresight, the ESPAS annual conference, and the title is very ambitious. Geopolitics is back, charting a course for the EU in a world of shifts and shocks. So I invite you to come either in presence in the library reading room or to follow us online for that event. And I would end this event by thanking also the colleagues that have been behind the scene, making it a success, notably Lasse Böhm here with us, and also Anne-Cécile Charlier, who is really behind the screen today. Thanks a lot to them, and thanks to everyone for this event. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye.